Therefore, putting away every falsehood, let everyone speak the truth with his neighbor, for we are members one of another. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. You may be seated. For those of you who still have kids that are in school, this is that time of the year again. It's that time of the year when all of the pants have suddenly turned into shorts. And we as parents have to go out and buy a whole new wardrobe for the kids. I think this is something that we all find true for ourselves, that over time we grow out of our old clothes and need to grow into new ones. I know for myself it's no longer in this direction, it's starting to become in this direction, that I'm growing out of my old clothes. But I think that as we look at our epistle today, St. Paul has a lot to say to us about growing out of old things and entering into new ones. So today I'd like to continue my sort of a sermon series preaching through Ephesians all the way to the end. And we're going to look at what St. Paul has to say about growing out of our old clothes in a spiritual sense. But I would like to start at the very end of the passage where St. Paul says this: Therefore, putting away falsehood, let everyone speak the truth with his neighbor, for we are members one of another. Now, I would hope that for those of you who have been here for the past few weeks and have heard this sermon series, I hope you hear that common theme coming up once again in Ephesians. The theme that binds all of Ephesians together, which is the Catholicity of the church. St. Paul says once again in this passage, we are members one of another. Now remember, as I said before, Catholicity is not about being Roman Catholic. It has nothing to do with the word Roman Catholic. The Catholicity of the church, as it has been understood through history and in the early church, refers primarily to the fundamental oneness of the church. It's internal unity that binds it together. As we talked about in our first sermon series on this topic, we discussed how the Catholicity of the church is grounded in the love of the Trinity, made possible in the Incarnation, how it is founded upon the Scriptures, and it is held together through all the ages in the sacred tradition of the church. This oneness is a oneness that isn't just bound to my oneness with you or my oneness with Christ or your oneness with Christ. It doesn't just bind us together in this room or here in America or even all Christians through all countries today. But as Christ himself transcends all time and all places, the oneness itself transcends all time and all places. We are one with the Christians of yesterday. We are the one with the Christians of yester-century. We are one with the Christians of yester-millennium. We are all bound together in the love of God and in the unity of Christ. Why is this so? It is so because Christ himself took on our humanity upon him. And because he is in us and because he is one, so we are one in one another. Therefore, the unity of the church in Christ is fundamental to the church itself. That, my friends, is the church's Catholicity. But then, of course, you already know this, don't you? Because I have been saying this for 3 weeks now. So all of this is nothing more than a review. In the same sort of a way for St. Paul, one of the unique things about St. Paul's writings is that typically the first half of all of his books are about doctrine. The second half of all of his books are about applying that doctrine. And so the unique thing that you might recognize about where we are in Ephesians is that Ephesians has 6 chapters. And if you look at your lections for today, we're on chapter 4. Half of 6 is 3, and that means that we have just transitioned from the doctrinal side of Catholicity to the practical side of Catholicity. Yes, my friends, Catholicity is not just a doctrine to be believed in. Rather, the Catholicity of the church is a doctrine to be lived. It's a way that we actually function as Christians. And it's something that we have to actually apply in our lives. And so the question that is before us today is, how do we actually live out this fundamental oneness that we all share with Jesus Christ by means of the incarnation? How do we all actually share in the life and love of the Trinity and live it out in our daily lives? That is precisely what St. Paul begins to talk about in this passage of Ephesians. And so now I can move on to my second point, where St. Paul gives us a very practical advice. He says this: "Put off your old nature, which belongs to your former manner of life and is corrupt through its deceitful lusts." Now, as a biblical scholar myself, the moment I saw the word nature, I knew that this was a terrible translation. I haven't said it from the pulpit yet, but there have been many terrible translations of Ephesians since we've started this sermon series. But this is one that I simply cannot abide by. This word nature does not at all show up in the Greek text. As a matter of fact, when I was a kid, the NIV always translated the word flesh into sin nature, and that threw me off theologically for years and years and years. And so here, seeing the word nature show up and mistranslated, I simply can't let it pass by. A better translation of this text, and I hope you'll notice the difference, is this. St. Paul says, "Put off the former conduct of the old man, which is decaying on account of deceitful desires." I'll read that for you again, since I'm the only one that has it written down. "Put off the former conduct of the old man, which is decaying on account of deceitful desires." Do you hear how that communicates something entirely different from what's written in the RSV English text? The word nature is not there. It's not the old nature that we put off, but rather the old man, the old way of life. This is important, my friends, and it's important for all of us to realize. Because even though most of us aren't philosophically trained, when we hear a philosophical word like nature, what that means to us is that by nature, or in other words, fundamentally, in our essence, in the deepest part of what we are sinful, corrupt, and evil. But that, my friends, is not the teaching of the Scriptures. And that is not the teaching of the church. Rather, the teachings of the Scriptures in the church in regards to human nature traces all the way back to Genesis 1 and 2, where God makes us and says, "It is good." Where God makes us in His image, in His likeness, and says, "It is good." The fundamental goodness of what we are as humans is something that God has done, and we have neither the power nor the authority to negate what He has done or His works. Fundamentally, what we are is good. But the teaching of original sin, according to the historical teaching of the church, is not that our good nature has been transformed into an evil nature. It's rather the good thing that we are has been bent and broken and diseased and corrupt. It's like a rudder on a boat. A rudder on a boat is a good thing, isn't it? Because by means of the rudder, the boat can steer where it's going. But if you take that rudder and you bend it, or you break it, or you cut a piece of it off, that rudder has not become fundamentally bad. It's still a rudder. It still, to some extent, does what it was intended to do. But nonetheless, it doesn't do what it was intended to do in a good or efficient manner. You may aim your boat in one direction and find that instead you're veering off to the right or to the left, or going in circles. Or that when you try to turn this direction or that direction, it turns very, very slowly and inefficiently. That's the same way with original sin. The doctrine of original sin doesn't say that we've been transformed into something evil by nature. Rather, it says that the clothes that we wear have been corrupted. That our nature has been bent, it's been broken, it's been hurt, it's been damaged, it's been diseased. And it needs fixed. Another important difference that I saw in this text is that this was interpreted as deceitful lusts, whereas better is the decaying on account of deceitful desires. This word put off is important here because this Greek word put off refers specifically to the taking off of clothes. I used to work a lot outside. And once your clothes get so dirty and so ratty for so long, there's just no returning them to their former state. They can get so bad. Here's a really good example. One year when I was a kid, and get this, I went to camp. And I forgot to pack socks. Can you imagine a kid at camp for an entire week with only one pair of socks? Let me tell you what, once I got back home and took those socks off, they stayed in the shape of my foot. There was no point in even washing them. Because of my activities, my clothing became corrupt. Started rotting on my own body. That is the imagery that St. Paul is using. And what is wrong here is not the nature of the man. What's wrong is not the man, but what he has on. Throw away the clothing and keep the man. And I think that this is an important lesson for each of us. How do we begin to live out the Catholicity of the Church? Throw off the old conduct. Throw off the old rotting clothes. Don't live according to the former man. But then again, this leaves us all naked, doesn't it? This isn't the whole story of what St. Paul has to say. Instead, he continues with this. He says, be renewed in the spirit of your minds, and put on the new nature, created after the likeness of God in true righteousness and holiness. Now, I hope all of you recognized once again the use of the word nature in this translation. And as you might suppose, once again, the word nature doesn't show up at all in the Greek text. Instead, the word here is once again man. He doesn't say put on the new nature. He says put on the new man. And the question that we have to ask now is, who is that new man? Now, note, I did not ask, what is that new man? I did not ask, what actions are that new man? I asked, who is that new man? Because so according to St. Paul, that new man is Christ. The old man who was Adam, as St. Paul says in Romans chapter 6, was given an opportunity to live to the fullness of his humanity and failed. But the new man, once again according to St. Paul, is Jesus Christ, the second Adam, who succeeded where Adam failed. Whereas the first Adam sinned and became corrupt, the second Adam did not sin and lived to glory. Whereas the first Adam lost the image and likeness of God, Christ came and restored it, the second Adam. Whereas the first Adam died in his sins, the second Adam died for the first Adam's sins and then rose again. What St. Paul is saying here is that the way we fix the problem is not merely by putting on new clothes, but by putting on Christ himself. By living out the incarnation in the world today and becoming one with the new man, that the image of man that has been restored in him might be restored in us as well. Christ came to live to the fullness of what humanity could be. And the more we imitate Christ and permit him to live within, through, and with us, we become conformed to his image. Do you see once again how St. Paul began with the incarnation and ends with the incarnation? And this, my friends, is our vocation. If Christ lives in me, and if he lives in you, and in you, and in you, and in you, then if each of us puts on Christ and lives in imitation of him, We will each of us together be formed into the oneness and conform to the one reality that he himself is. The whole church would be bound together in the love that he is. And our conduct will be conformed to the conduct that he is. The way that we live out the incarnation is by putting him on in our daily lives. To forgive like he forgives. To have mercy as he has mercy. To love as he loves. To act as he acts in every moment of our daily life. With a grace that is beyond measure. So that we too can put off the old man. Throw away those old and dirty clothes. And put on the new man, Christ himself. Created after the likeness of God. In true righteousness and holiness. Therefore, putting away all falsehood, let everyone speak the truth with his neighbor. For we are members one of another. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen.